There we are.
All right.
So Doug's not here this week. He had some personal stuff, and he's usually the one who plays kind of moderator here, even though we don't really have a moderator, but he kind of somewhat plays that role. So hello, everybody.
Hello.
Howdy. Happy Easter.
Yeah, and we're on the last two chapters of Margaret Barker's The Great Angel, chapter 10 and 11. Like I said, my own personal views on this book really haven't changed. I'm just repeating myself like a broken record for the last few Hangouts. I think the amount of evidence she's putting out is just a little overwhelming, and I can't take it all in and deal with it. So I really don't think my opinion of the book is all that well informed because I'm just having trouble grasping with it all. But none of her individual arguments seems that persuasive to me. I think she's just taking a lot of weak and circumstantial stuff and just arbitrarily drawing lines between them. And I get the suspicion that I could be being duped, but maybe not. Maybe there actually is something here. Maybe she's right. I mean, I can't tell either way, really. I'm just really cautious about it, but I don't know what to make of it.
I have a similar sentiment, and I think the degree to which you are correct in that kind of became clear to me in the last chapter, when specifically, like when we were doing the Moll book, it was when he said that Marcion rejected Matthew, and a big red flag came up for me that day. But here was when she was discussing Psalm 110. It suddenly dawned on me that no, I don't think this is I think she's using an erroneous interpretation of that psalm in order to support the great angel thesis, and I just found myself sitting there going, wait a minute, that's not right.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by that? What do you?
It seems to me that in the Psalm 110 where it says, "The Lord said to my Lord, make a footstool of thine enemies," and stuff like that. You know that.
Yeah.
It's used in Mark, and it's also used in Matthew, I believe.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the passage. Contrast how she's taking it with how you take it.
Well, she's using it in order to reinforce her argument of the great angel theology. But I think she has an erroneous, which is not hers. It's the traditional Christian interpretation of that passage, and I get that. But
what do you think? What do you think is the correct reading of it?
I think that you have to ask yourself, in order to answer that question, you have to ask yourself, in that psalm, who is speaking? And who is speaking in that psalm are the Levite priests, and the first Lord is God, and the second Lord is not the great angel. The second Lord is King David.
I agree.
Yeah,
with that.
I agree with that.
Wouldn't my Lord be a very common way to refer to a king back then? It just seems.
Yeah, but not only that, I think that is the prima facie reading of that passage. It's the easiest. What do they call it? The plain reading.
Well, plus we got to remember in the original Hebrew it says Yahweh says to my Lord, not the Lord says to my Lord, right?
Well, it says it's Kyrios. We're talking about the Septuagint.
Oh, the Septuagint. Okay.
But it's Kyrios, and then the other word is I think in the Hebrew it's Ladoni, which is Lord in the sense of yes, my Lord.
Okay.
Like a king.
Okay, gotcha. Because I couldn't remember if the first Lord was one of those times where they translate, the Tetragrammaton or whatever into the Lord, So.
But then when I started thinking about this, I realized, okay, if this one slipped by, and I caught this one, where I don't think it applies to her argument, but she argues so strongly for it that it makes me realize, well, if this one didn't slip me by, but some other ones probably did. Or you dig what I'm saying? And so the rest, I don't know which of her examples are valid and which are not.
Leon, do you remember what page this discussion was on? I don't remember her treatment of this passage.
Oh gosh, I have to open. Hold on, I gotta open up my Kindle.
When I look up in the scripture index in the back, it points to page 229, but I don't.
Maybe 200. I know.
Yeah, it's around. It's in the early It's in the early 200s.
I see a reference to Psalm 110 on page 200 for certain.
Okay.
Whether that's the passage you're talking about is a different question.
But this I have to. I'm just stressing that was a big red flag for me, and it made me realize kind of how much salt I should take this book. If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
How many grains of salt I should be taking it with.
Yeah, I'm seeing that all along. Every chapter of this book, there's parts that I just don't that just seem too weak to me, and she's making her whole argument out of an accumulation of individually weak arguments, which I don't like to be valid methodology.
I've been with you all along, actually, but that one really crystallizes it for me.
I also didn't really follow her when she's talking about the book of Revelation. I understand that there's, that the revelation is given to John through an angel and stuff, but I don't follow where she's getting that Jesus himself is ever called an angel in Revelation. I could just be missing that. She could be right. I didn't find where she was talking about.
But I think I should say that. But it makes me think about, it's not just Margaret Barker, it's Eusebius, all these people who have this idea in mind that she's trying to formulate a thesis out of. I think that it's a case of misunderstood metaphors run amok.
Yeah, that's what I've been saying all along. A lot of this weird stuff in the theology is just trying to make sense of language that previous generations have used that has become confusing over time, mostly in written texts.
And so if I had to summarize my impression of the book, I would say they're brilliant speculations, some of which are not as strong as others.
Yeah.
That sounds fair to me.
I also think I think her New Testament chapters, these last two chapters, may be part of the strongest parts of her book, but only because she's taken Christian ideas and retroactively trying to force them back into the Old Testament in places they didn't really belong.
Right.
Yeah, I could see that too, and the one thing, I could probably agree with her general thesis, but like a lot of you say, that it's some of the particulars I have problems with. I'm not so sure that all the individual things she offers for evidence are correct or spot on or even close sometimes. But I think I was reading today a book I sent Dale, and he in this book, I think it's co-written by Philip R. Davies and some others, but he's basically talking about the documentary hypothesis. And he says, Wellhausen's intuition that until the Babylonian exile, no Judaism existed, only Israelite paganism, was basically correct. And so my opinion that that's true has not changed. I don't see any. She didn't convince me that, for instance, we're dealing with an earlier or more authentic Judaism. I still see it as a kind of Canaanite-influenced paganism.
Right. I think I'm with you on that. And if you don't mind, I really like Philip Davies. You should send me that book.
Yeah. Just a quick point on methodology. Some people have the idea that evidence can be good enough if it's in quantity. That even if your evidence individual pieces are weak, as long as you have enough of them, you can make a strong overall argument. But that's actually a logical flaw. If you check the validity of that reasoning using like Bayesian analysis, you find out that the strength of the overall argument can never, under any circumstance, ever be stronger than the strongest individual piece of evidence for it. Right. That's your upper limit to how good your overall argument can be.
Yeah, it's kind of like significant. It's like significant figures.
Yeah, so if all her individual evidences are all kind of weak, that limits her overall argument to at best being kind of weak.
Well, I think that some of her arguments she has strong cases for, but others not so.
What are you thinking in particular? I mean, some of the stuff I think she has good things to say about, like the wisdom literature and stuff, but I still believe that's all metaphorical originally. I don't think, they really meant it to be a hypostasis or anything,
Right, yeah, an angelic entity or something.
Yeah,
I know the Gnostics later did, but they're just, doing their normal speculation on, older texts that didn't have that idea.
I think her most broadest thesis that there's a connection between what some of the early beliefs were that fed into the later times, I think is correct because, a lot of what we have problems with is that in the writings, in the various factions of Judaism, there's too much interpreting going on. A lot of things are misunderstood. A lot of things are given new interpretations that had no foundation previously. But there are some currents, and I think where they existed was in the common people, the same way that a lot of people say that a lot of pagan beliefs submerged into European culture and became, the basis of witchcraft and that kind of stuff, where, the common people carry certain ideas, but they're not very developed. They're just some very particular strands that are kind of nebulous, and preserve them in their daily lives. Like, some of the old Canaanite practices, for instance, might have survived quite a long time, as long as there weren't any temple representatives from Jerusalem hanging around, So that kind of stuff, I could imagine, could continue over long periods of time and feed into various streams later on. But a lot of the evidence she's bringing about is stuff that's directly from what's produced by the elites, the literates, the tops of the classes and so forth. So that's when you start getting into a lot of alternate explanations and theories.
Yeah, I think some of those folksy traditions that you're talking about, they're tribal, and they're not so clearly defined. They're almost like familial. It's kind of like, it's like me saying, take it with a grain of salt or whatever. It's kind of like, what does that mean? It's like an old wives' tale or whatever. It's not really anything that has any theological foundation behind it.
And that would explain a lot of diversity in the earliest forms of this movement, that came about at that particular time in history, is that there's a lot of different viewpoints about some related concepts, So that's what I think. That would more likely explain a lot of this cultural continuities than, anything that you could literally point to as, a causal chain, because it's weak. That the links between those things are kind of the weakest point, in my opinion.
You can probably tell that I've been leaning in her direction this whole time, but particularly her main point to me is most persuasive. That is that there were two powers in heaven, a greater God and a lesser God. The greater God over the overall pantheon, and the lesser God was the local deity, Jehovah, over Israel. And and it looks to me, I think maybe Wayne, you made the comment, or somebody, that basically the Israelites were pagans in the sense, or they were purely Canaanites. They were, this was Canaanite religion, the great god El over Baal, and Baal is Jehovah or Yahweh in this story, and that's how it developed. And I can't help but see that over and over again in everything she's pointing out. And I agree, though, Wayne, you mentioned that she gives you such a flood of texts, and some sound like they're forced and possibly are. And that's why it was helpful to me to, this week I was reading another book taking that similar perspective by a famous Jewish scholar named Daniel Boyarin, called The Jewish Gospels, where he actually makes it simple, and he just focuses first on Daniel 7 as the main text that makes the case although he doesn't talk as she does in terms of First Temple Judaism, he just says this is an early form of Judaism that was already existed when Jesus came on the scene, and Jesus and the early church bought into it, and that's why so many accepted him as Messiah, is because it wasn't a new thing. It was already an existing theology of the two gods, an older God and a younger God.
I kind of prefer his phrasing, because her phrasing, when she specifies that it's First Temple expressions, that's kind of where the red flag for me comes up, because if she hasn't demonstrated that. She's demonstrated that it's older. I would agree with that. That it's older than the Second Temple, I should say.
Yeah, and I think the terminology I have a problem with too, because favoring minimalism, it kind of like what First Temple?
Right. And so
I
I
was
think
hoping
that
somebody else would say that. Yeah, I've been wondering if I'm supposed to think there was a First Temple at all or not.
But I think that's part of my rub with her thesis. Even though, we've said it before, she's really a brilliant woman, and for the most part, I agree with you, Dale, that she's demonstrated that there's an old Canaanite tradition where there was the big God and the little God, or if you were to phrase it that way, I'm just phrasing it simply. But if that's the original Judaism, that's the First Temple Judaism, that part of her argument is, to me, highly speculative.
Dale, what was the name of the book you're reading again? I'm sorry.
I think it's called the Jewish Gospels.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I would almost favor calling it just Canaanite theology instead of First Temple theology.
I would actually prefer that, but I think she kind of needs it to be Temple theology, because that's her whole thesis in all her books. If you know what I'm saying? It's kind of her specialty is temple, temple renovation theology.
And she sees the significance, not just that this was what they believed in First Temple times, but the temple itself was an important aspect to it, apparently.
Right.
In some of her later books, she goes into detail about how some of the rituals that are preserved in Christianity are like holdovers from the earlier temple rituals. And there, again, you would get into the same kind of problem as, are those links that strong?
But for example, I'm just curious, John, you mentioned from a minimalist perspective the doubt of a First Temple. Because, for example, when you read someone like Ezekiel and he talks about the things that are going on in the temple that he considers blasphemous, what temple do you think he's describing?
Probably an ideal one, but I guess mainly based on the temple he was familiar with, which was probably the one that was constructed by the returners from Babylon.
No, I'm talking about Ezekiel. He's talking. He's in. Well, maybe you.
Yeah, maybe I'm placing him a lot later.
I see.
In other words, he's implying that it's a retroductive writing.
Yeah, he's criticizing his present and what he has problems with it, with an ideal past. You know
right.
What I mean? And it could have been a First Temple, but I don't. It probably would have been along different lines. Certainly not as described in Kings.
That's why this is somewhat appealing to me. Is it's she's showing that they had a temple, and the temple was just this. It was just a Canaanite temple. It was just one of many, except they claimed. And then there was this intentional reform to try to stamp out all the other competing high places and make this the only one. And I see that. I see that switch that went on, with the Deuteronomic reforms, and so there was a priesthood that existed that enforced this. That that all fits to me. A priesthood that existed in the temple before the exile. I guess I find the I'd have to read, I guess, somebody try to make the case for a minimalist perspective and place doubt on all of that. I've already moved quite a bit to believe that they were a Canaanite and they weren't, they weren't monotheistic all along.
She does mention that she does kind of like get close to that view. I've noticed in a few places, but she doesn't really make that leap. She still wants it to be kind of like just a different form of Judaism, but basically what you might find in a reading of the Bible, But she does flirt with the idea of there being polytheistic influences, but I don't think she goes far enough.
I think in fact, now that we're saying that, I think she kind of goes out of her way to minimize that influence sometimes.
Yeah, oh yeah, exactly. There's a couple times where, like her arguments about the disappearance of the goddess and so forth. If by the same logic you could say that just as the goddess kind of disappeared and was assumed into Yahweh, that the great angel, same thing could have actually happened. So, just how strongly were they still considered separate? But anyway, I agree with Dale that I see that there is still that multiplicity of deities that is a survival from that earlier time. That to me is a thesis that I already accepted, so it really wasn't a big deal to hear all the details.
I agree, and I think in a sense what she's trying to do is she's taking that sense that we all have of, wait, that's kind of weird. It's like, so you're telling me then that it wasn't so radically monotheistic, and she's just kind of trying to make sense of that, and this is the way she did it.
Exactly.
In a sense, she's created an interest in me to want to learn more about Canaanite theology then to see. In fact, I just started reading a book called The Early History of God by Mark S. Smith to try to understand the Canaanite theology, thinking in terms of this is, if I read it and I understand things from Margaret Barker's perspective, that may reinforce my agreement with her. If I see that, because apparently he's looking at the Ugaritic Rosh Shamra texts that describe all the mythology of the Canaanites, and apparently, the El and Baal, and if it ties in as she's been describing, she doesn't quote that literature. That literature goes even before anything that she's citing, but if it agrees, then it seemed like it would fit that theory.
Yeah, I have that one. I have that book.
I'm glad to have read this book, actually, because I've been studying this for a while now, but I've been mostly focusing on the New Testament. And this book made me realize that I don't read enough about the Old Testament stuff.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things I learned that I never would have heard of probably anywhere else, or maybe only by a vastly more wide reading. But it didn't seem to be. It seemed to be worth reading it, to get that stuff, whether you agreed or not, whether I agreed or not.
Well, it's like I always say, and I think Dr. Price talks about this all the time too. Nothing wrong with speculation. Speculation is the grease that keeps the wheels turning.
Actually, it's interesting when Daniel Boyarin, since he doesn't paint such a broad, since he doesn't try to cover so much ground with so many quotes and so many, like Margaret Barker does, where you think it's so broad and thin. He just focuses on, on very few things. So in the Bible, he focuses on Daniel 7, and in extra biblical literature, he just focuses on Enoch. And those are enough to establish the fact that this really did exist before Jesus came on the scene. And that's all he had to basically establish in order to show that the Christians didn't invent the theology. In fact, the case he's trying to make is that Christianity should be just considered he's trying to overcome the Christian Judaism barrier and just to say it's an inter-Jewish debate. This was a valid Jewish debate at the time, and it shouldn't be considered outside of Judaism.
The way Barker approaches it is that she does that on a book-by-book basis. So, like, I think Dale, you said you had recently acquired the Older Testament. Yeah. So you can see that's much narrower and focused. I mean, it does go over all the literature of that period, but it's still focused mainly on that. But after 2 or 3 books, she wanted to do the Great Angel, where it kind of ties together all that stuff. So she's throwing her entire argument into it, summarized it from beginning to end into one piece. So I think that's one of the things that influences one's perspective. But I wanted to ask Leon, is speculation-wise, does that include at-will?
Only to the degree that yes, but just like we don't have to accept Margaret Barker, we don't have to accept at-will, and just because we don't accept both of them doesn't mean we don't accept it to the same degree. Or like Eisenman to me too.
Well, there's some people that they're so fringe that it's almost not worth reading. You're not learning anything really about.
Yeah, but I think at-will is particularly kind of weird, let's say, because I think he's trying to base everything on a methodology which is not appropriate, but he's insisting that it is. It's kind of weird. I mean, we could talk about at-will if you want, but I think I need to temper my language because he's been called crazy by people I know. Let's leave it at that.
Whereas the Dr. Price let 100 flowers bloom. Just my garden wouldn't have that many flowers in it. That's all.
Yeah, but I mean, it includes, and I don't really care for at-will, or I don't really care for Acharya, but I think that their work is at least as important as that 100-flower greasing the wheels of speculation kind of way.
Well, I did try to read Caesar's Messiah, and I didn't get out of it as much as something else that might be considered fringe, like The Real Messiah by Stephen Huller.
Yeah.
Yeah, now that there's so many historical details in there that I wasn't following his thesis, but I was making other connections about stuff that I had already read, so it was a worthwhile read,
I was persuaded enough by people like David Trovish to recognize the value of someone like Huller, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I just think that some people just what they're contributing is very little. You know what I mean? So Huller would contribute a lot because of his vast historical research that he put into his book, for instance. But if like Caesar's Messiah seems to just to be all interpretation from start to finish. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think most importantly, his Achilles heel, Atwill's Achilles heel is he's insisting that his methodology is sounder than thou, and it's just so not. I think he's using a methodology that's only valid in the humanities, and even then in very limited aspects of the humanities like psychology.
I didn't mean to derail the conversation, but one point to bring it back in is that I think that Barker is in a wholly different category. She's from start to finish, she's worth reading in all aspects.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think Miss Barker is a brilliant mind.
In fact, it amazes me the breadth of her knowledge. Yeah. It's hard to imagine someone going that breadth. Actually, it's similar to Dr. Price. It amazes me all the time how much he remembers, how much he's read, and how much he remembers.
Yeah, totally. I see what you mean there.
Yeah.
I think the difference.
I agree with you that Barker does seem brilliant overall and does have lots and lots of background knowledge and stuff, but yet there seems to be pieces where I think essential knowledge is missed. Like, she quotes sections of the Pauline epistles that are quite clearly later interpolations, as if they were part of the original of what Paul wrote.
Right,
and I think that's just really sloppy, or ignorant, one of the two.
That's kind of what I was talking about, like with my interpretation, or her interpretation of Psalm 110. It's Eusebius's interpretation of that kind of a thing, and even Paul's interpretation. As a matter of fact, I was reading earlier this little bit from this book by Harold Bloom, where he basically does like a review of the Gospel of John, and it's so freaking good. You guys should read it. And at one point, he says something along the lines of how sloppy Paul was in his exegesis of the Hebrew Scriptures.
By the way, Leon, going back to the Psalm 110 thing, then, because so far we had just focused on page 200. Because if that's what you have in mind, I mean, she's doing a survey of how different early Christians have interpreted. Basically, she's trying to show how they bought into what she's seeing as the two powers, and Jesus is Jehovah and so forth. So she's quoting Eusebius and his point of view on Psalm 110, right?
Oh, I know, but it's important. As far as I say,
she hasn't made. I'm curious to see where has she actually made a comment on Psalm 110 where you're criticizing it. I can see how you may be criticizing what Eusebius, the way Eusebius understood it. But I'm curious, where is it that you're criticizing something he's wrong about Psalm 110?
No, in a way, you're right. I'm actually criticizing the early Christian interpretation of that passage. Not necessarily her. I'm only criticizing her by proxy because she seems to say, see, the Christians believe this, and therefore this lends credence to my thesis. And that's true, and I understand that it does do that. But as far as I'm concerned, that's an erroneous interpretation of that passage, and I don't think it's even we're talking about Canaanite religion. I don't think it's even that. I think it's just erroneous, plain erroneous.
In these last two chapters, she mentions Psalms 110 on page 200 and page 229, but she also mentions it 3 or 4 earlier times in the book in earlier chapters.
Yeah. But did I answer your question, Dale?
Yeah, you've answered it about page 200, I guess, and what problem you had with it. I guess, in other words, if she's citing Eusebius and yet you think he's taking it in a wrong, he's basically twisting the text, then why is he quoting her? And I understand, in a sense, as I see it, she's probably saying, these guys, this is the doctrine I think the early church held out, and look at Eusebius. In other words, she's throwing out all the quotes to show, yeah, they agreed with me. Even if they're using the wrong text to make the point, they still believe this.
No, yeah, and they did.
For her to quote him when discussing Psalm 110 doesn't necessarily mean that she agrees with his view on Psalm 110, just that it's evidence to show that he believed this view overall,
Right. No. Yeah. Like I said, I only have a rub with her by proxy on this one, but I think it's really, really important, because if her thesis is that what she's calling First Temple Judaism bypassed the Second Temple and went into the Christianity, I don't think that interpretation of Psalm 110 was part of that Canaanite First Temple pantheon, or whatever we want to call it. Yes, she demonstrated that there was such a thing as a higher God and a lower God, but if you can, how do I put this? She's tampering with the evidence, or putting evidence that's irrelevant.
I guess
that thesis.
I mean, it's possible for her to say Eusebius also agreed with me and give a quote, but again, she's explaining. Look.
Yeah, but my question, Dale, is, where did Eusebius get it from? Was it from the First Temple? I say no. I don't think it could have been. And so it's an erroneous interpretation of a metaphor that was commonplace at the time, yes. But I don't think it goes back to the first temple.
Okay. I guess the reason why I don't have a problem, well, I may have already said this, so I apologize. The reason why this doesn't seem, we know that, well, maybe I should put it to you as a question, Leon, all right? So it seems like you and I agree that basically this concept of the two powers in heaven was a doctrine the Canaanites held. So it's
Yes.
that early, all right?
Yes.
It's that early. Then the Jews, at a certain point during, anyway, if you want to buy into the idea, it was King Josiah during this Deuteronomic reforms, all right, shortly before they go into exile in Babylon, he actually enforces monotheism to try to change this theology. Do you also believe that that happened, basically, at that time?
Yeah, I think there was such a thing as Deuteronomic reforms of King Josiah, and I don't know exactly what form they took, but I think that there was a move to monotheize, if I can use that word, monotheize the temple.
Would you?
I don't know if I've changed my mind on that, but yeah, I agree that there wasn't any Deuteronomic reforms as outlined in the Bible, but I think there was a change in religion, and I think it was imposed by Assyrian influence of kind of like a henotheism, where a lot of the vassal treaty type kingdoms or the kingdoms that exist only by the grace of the Assyrian Empire as in the States were forced into like kind of like accepting a modified Marduk kind of as an overlord god. Maybe.
But you're saying, John, the traditional monotheism that Jews are proud to claim that they've always had since the time of Abraham. When do you put that? Because came about
in Persia.
What you just said about the Assyrian influence, I don't see how that would support a monotheism. They may have
henotheism.
So you're saying that that was the first time that the Jews became henotheists was when the Assyrians came?
Yeah, because there is some kind of like idea that I think from the archaeology that there was a change of religion at that period, and it seems to have come from Assyria, but I can't give you the reference right now. I'd have to look it up, but I could. But that's what I thought was there was like an imposed kind of standardized worship kind of form on the kingdoms that were still semi-autonomous as satellites of the Assyrian Empire. But it wasn't until Babylon where they encountered Persian monotheism that came about. But they were kind of like primed for it in a way.
I guess I almost think or wonder if I guess I almost consider them henotheists all along in the sense that when I say henotheists as opposed to monotheists, I'm like, in other words, the whole time Baal is their god or Jehovah is their god, whichever term you want to say. In other words,
the term monolatry might be a better one. Whereas, yeah, they're probably henotheists. Pretty much, all other gods were existent, but we should, worship just Yahweh. But I'm thinking that the idea that one god was overall, that had a higher status than other gods was like a Assyrian innovation.
Oh, really? So you don't think?
In a way, it matches the empire. The idea of empire is that you're imposing culture, your will on other peoples, and also certain religious ideas as well. So it kind of ties in with the imperialism of the period.
But you don't think that this idea of a chief god predates the Assyrian?
Maybe not as widespread. I think maybe what I'm saying is it's like a state kind of sponsored monolatry. would be like the first occurrence of it in that region.
Because actually, from my perspective, it seems to me that the more I'm looking at this perspective through Margaret Barker's glasses, it almost seems like the Jews then don't look any different from any other ancient Near Eastern people, and so that they all, even the Egyptians, and the Hittites, I imagine, and all these other ancient Near Eastern kingdoms all have a chief god acknowledging all these other gods, so that even during this time of Akhenaten, I was corresponding a little bit with Shauna,
Yeah, it's like that axial age concept where just at certain periods of history, a lot of the same synchronistic ideas take hold multiculturally.
Yeah, and we're wondering even,
No, it makes sense. What you're saying about pantheons usually have a pinnacle, a zenith. Zeus, there's El, there's Odudua, there's a whole bunch of top level, and I think that from that perspective, it doesn't, like if Margaret Barker's thesis is correct, it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case from that perspective.
Exactly, and that's the way I'm looking at it. I guess I'm wondering, in fact, was there ever a time in the ancient Near East that this wasn't the case? That they all had this perspective that basically there's a bunch of gods sitting at the table, and there's a chairman at the table,
But I mean, that's a good question, but I think that I'm just kind of shooting from the hip, but I think the answer may lie in it was all tribal until it was finally centralized by a quote-unquote temple.
Yeah, we don't really know all the details about what prompted things like that. Even in the Northern Kingdom, if there ever was any unified kingdom, it was probably based on the Kingdom of Israel. That's what became Samaria. We don't know what the impetus was for that.
Dale, is that your book?
Oh, it is.
Far out, man. I didn't know you wrote a book.
That went by so quickly.
He's now famous. He's on YouTube.
Right on. I'll look into it. Sorry, I didn't mean to disrupt the flow of it.
He brought it up again.
There he is.
Far out.
Cool.
Well, since we're already talking about
Read
it,
a book
can we
cover.
take an excursion from Barker to give like a 3-minute explanation of this book on Revelation?
Yeah,
we've already started talking about it, so yeah.
No, yeah, it's kind of true because he does go into this.
Actually, well, here's the basic premise of it. Although I never got to join you guys with the previous, Wayne, you've mentioned a few times how interesting that one was on Revelation, so I really want to get into that one of these days.
John Marshall's Parables of War.
Okay, cool. But basically, mine is an attempt to be eclectic and draw on different insights, and so first I review the four basic. I basically explain that if you take all the commentaries that have ever been written on Revelation, you can put them into four different categories. The way they treat Revelation, either the futurist perspective, that everything basically is going to happen in the future, or a historicist perspective, that during the whole church age, it's describing different things that have happened, from the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of Islam and things like that. Or a preterist perspective that either describes, past events, either the fall of Jerusalem or the fall of Rome, or the idealist perspective, which takes a more nebulous perspective, thinking that they're basically kind of describing principles that happen throughout history, the cyclical things like evil conquering good, good conquering evil, or things of that sort, the need to endure under persecution, so forth. But anyway, my attempt was to be eclectic and draw on the insights from different camps and bring them together in an eclectic form. And so my end perspective, which is new and I've never seen it before, but it draws on the insights of these different camps, is that the basic structure of Revelation consists of three series of judgments: the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls. That they are successive judgments. They're not the same. like the idealist camp that says we just see a kind of repetition, of the same thing looked at from different perspectives. I really think they're describing 3 different judgments on 3 different groups of people, the enemies of God's people who are persecuting the people of God. The first 2 representing the 2 preterist camps, that is, the seal judgments are describing the judgment on Jerusalem, and then the seal judgments describing the judgment on Rome, and then the bowl, that's the final judgment describing the future destruction of all, basically of the world, when Christ returns. So there's a futurist aspect as well. So in other words, the two persecutors of the church in the first century were the Jews and the Romans. At least the book of Acts, the main persecutors, the Jews throughout. And these are the 2 persecutors of Jesus also. He died at the hands of the Jews and the Romans. So these are the 2 enemies, the 2 near judgments in a sense. And as each one is fulfilled, they're pointers to the future fulfillment, kind of a guarantee. When this one is fulfilled, then you know that the future one will be fulfilled.
That's interesting, Dale. Yeah, I don't want to argue against you here in this hangout. I just wanted a quick summary of what your book was about.
Right.
But
It was a good read. I liked it. It was.
Yeah.
I totally disagreed with it,
but part of what I took away from reading Marshall's book, though, was I think the first set of judgments are on the armies coming against Jerusalem, and then a set against the city of Rome and the Roman Empire itself, and then against all the nations that have assisted Rome, and have been part of her sins. I do not think that Revelation has any judgment on Jerusalem. I think that's based on an interpolation in one of the texts that's not part of the original document. And I think in the original document, Jerusalem is always on the side of being protected by God, not judged.
By the way, part of it too is, in my perspective, I think that the harlot Babylon is Jerusalem, unfaithful Jerusalem.
Yeah, I don't. But
Old
yeah,
Testament.
we can agree to disagree. Yeah.
Sure. No, but I just wanted to give an idea of why I came to that perspective, and I do think that in the Old Testament, she is the main harlot. That the harlot's always ever applied to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's in a wife. She's the wife of God, who's then gone unfaithful and gone whoring after the nations. And so I think that's the imagery that's being played out there. But anyway, that's part of the reason. And also, I do want to give you also the idea that when I was a Christian and I was drawn to this idea, so I had this idea that the book of Revelation was written before 70 AD then, and this was a prophecy of something that was going to happen soon, near at hand,
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. Yeah.
But I eventually came to the perspective of the majority that date the book of Revelation after the fall of Jerusalem, but basically trying to present it as a future event. So basically writing prophecy after the fact.
Yeah, the reason I don't buy that is that I think if it was written after the fact, his prophecies wouldn't have failed. I mean, I think it's explicitly saying that the temple will be preserved, and it wasn't preserved. So that then, and the only way that mistake could have been made is if it was written before the destruction of the temple.
Well, actually, I guess you'd have to read also my take then on the destruction. That section that talks about the preservation of the temple, I think is Revelation 11. It actually measures out the temple. In other words, part of it is protected and part of it is cast outside. I think it's the outer courtyards are cast out. I think so. In other words, I think there's a spiritualizing of the temple. The inner temple are the faithful remnant, and the outer courtyard are basically the unfaithful Jews, that they're the ones that will face God's judgment. But those that have sided with Christ, those Jews that have accepted Christ, this goes parallel with the Revelation 7 and the description of the 144,000 Jews. So in other words, these are the faithful remnant, Jewish remnant that are sealed, with a protective mark kind of like Ezekiel,
Yeah.
The
I should read your book, and you should read John Marshall's book, and then we should discuss this again.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I have a copy of it. I definitely want to read it.
I'd wait to the new edition, though, Wayne, because he's got to incorporate the John Felix theories into it.
Yeah. But sticking to the book of Revelation here and going back to Barker, I didn't really follow Barker's argument where she's saying that Jesus himself was described as an angel in Revelation. Am I just missing something there that she's right about, or did she make a mistake? I mean, I didn't follow the argument. So can somebody summarize that for me?
I can't remember that it's explicit in Revelation, but I did personally take, for example, that when there's an angel that you see standing on the land and the sea, there's certain things about the description of that gigantic angel that is, I feel, fits the description of the angel of the Lord. And since I already buy into her belief that Jesus is the angel of the Lord, so I believe that that is Jesus as the angel of the Lord. So I presented it that way in my commentary, but I don't think.
I guess I'm missing where in the text of Revelation any of the figures that are given explicit descriptions. I know there's mentions of angels in it, but they're in passing. I don't remember any character given an explicit description ever being called an angel.
I think that the fact that the book of Revelation is in the genre of an apocalyptic writing.
The discussion of the angels that are, on the throne,
right,
stands and all that, they're specifically called angels.
Yeah, but those are the angels on the thrones. What Wayne is saying is they're not specifically Jesus. And I'm with him on that.
Yeah, I think the Lamb is or eventually was interpreted that way.
Right, yeah. I have a hard time with the book of Revelation, actually. When I'm elected Pope, I'm going to take a razor and cut it off and toss it. Because I think it's been the source of much human stuff. But I won't go there right now.
The other issue I had with these chapters is where she talks about the Son of Man being identical with the Son of Elyon, the man, the way she says it. And I never got the connection to Elyon was described as the man. So I'm missing her link there.
Wasn't that part of what she was talking about where they had degrees of representation where animals usually represented humans, and if you encountered a human, that usually was representative of an angelic spirit. And if you had angels, you're basically talking about emanations or aspects of the highest divine spirits.
Okay, that I think it's arbitrary rule she's using at some points then. I agree that some of the apocalyptic literature may be doing that, but I don't think it's carrying over to the entire body of literature, and I think she's misusing it.
Yeah, I would probably apply it to Daniel, but yeah, if you would say that categorically should be applied across the board, then yeah, it's problematic.
By the way, Wayne, the thing that I was thinking of when you were asking the question about the angel and Jesus, it was Revelation 10. Where it speaks about another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head, and his face like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire, and he has a little scroll in his hand, and he's standing on the land and the sea.
There you go.
All that imagery, I think, comes from the Old Testament description of the angel of the Lord.
Okay, I'll look that up then.
Yeah,
but
I would
isn't that the angel that's looking for somebody who's worthy to open the scroll? And Jesus is the one who is worthy, so if the angel is Jesus, that gets really confusing.
No, I think it's the same scroll, but it's bringing the scroll back into the story. We see the scroll, and that's what you're just describing. I think it's Revelation 5. It's the temple scene, and the scroll, basically the question is who can open the scroll, and it seals, and it's the Lamb of God.
Yeah.
That's chapter 5, and then later on in chapter 10, we see this angel with it. So we already find out the angel has the right to open the scrolls, and now in chapter 10, Jesus has the right to open the scroll. And in chapter 10, this mighty angel has it in his hands. I think that's Jesus,
Okay, I'll look at that again later when I get more time. That gives me something to work with. Thank you.
Sure.
That would qualify.
Yeah, Barker makes a big deal about that.
I know Barker's written a commentary on Revelation. Too bad it's so expensive.
I listened to some of her YouTube videos regarding Revelation, and maybe they're good, but a lot of what she was saying just seemed not plausible to me, so I kind of lost credibility with her listening to her talk about it.
A lot of those were kind of like tailored to her audience, so she.
Or she lost credibility with me. I mean, I said that wrong, but yeah.
I've also been listening to some of her videos. I guess I can't get beyond the idea. I think I'm not a minimalist, but I'm certainly no evangelical anymore. But I can't get beyond the idea that there was a first temple, that the first, excuse me, there was a time that in the first temple they weren't monotheists, so they're Canaanites. So in other words, before the Reform, the worship that went on in the first temple was the worship that we see going on among the Canaanites. And that just seems a logical connection. Like, you see that flow. There was a belief that existed before the Reform, and what was it? The Canaanite one. So that's the first temple perspective with two gods.
Yeah, but that implies that we know the extent. That implies that we know that it was such a pervasive thing, when in reality we're learning more and more that whatever temple there was, whatever kingdom of Israel there might have been, was this limited tribal thing that was nowhere near the dimensions that we've been taught to think they were. Or at least that's my view on it.
Yep. My view on it is that there's not really a continuity between these different eras, except for they have texts from earlier times that they try to interpret. And some of the stuff she says that these different eras have in common are certain phrases and uses of language and stuff, but they all come from later people reinterpreting earlier texts and using the same language. I think it's just a lot of reinvention going on. I don't really think there's a continuity of a belief just being carried through.
Well, now that you say it, I remember that you said this before, that it's possible that they just rediscover something that others had seen it before, similar to, I think you even mentioned the comparison to the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Aryans. It's not that they intentionally depended on the Aryans, or they weren't in a continuity, an unbroken continuity with the Aryans or something.
Yeah, and I think you're going to get more similarities the more early texts the later groups are trying to work with and make sense of. But I think it's just a text. I think the only continuity is the text itself, really.
But it does make sense to me that, I see your point on that, except, and this is obviously part of her reason for going so broad in her coverage, is to show, look, this was held by the people that wrote the Targums, especially the Palestinian Targums. This is the perspective of Philo now in the Jewish community in Egypt. This was the perspective, we see some of this perspective going on in some of the writers of the Old Testament, like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and, some other non-Deuteronomical texts. So they all share this perspective. And especially when she talks about the fact, and especially since when we covered Finkelstein, we know that the majority of Jews didn't go into Babylon. They stayed behind, and they even went into Egypt. So it seems realistic to me to think that they're the ones that didn't. They're the ones that held on to the previous theology. That not everyone was going to switch to the new, to the new party line. There was still people that they believed this, and they're not going to change just because they were told to.
I guess my issue is that it's not like we see a continuity of ideas that, just looking at them kind of in isolation, we have no idea where they came from. It's like, the Christian weird things about the Trinity really seem, the most plausible explanation of where they came from is that they're just ways of trying to understand Old New Testament texts. A lot of these Jewish speculation and stuff, it seems like their origins come from ambiguities in the text. We don't have to look elsewhere to find explanations, why they have these ideas. And it just seems to be that the best explanation in every case seems to be, well, they had these texts and they're trying to make sense of them.
I'm following what you're saying, Wayne.
I guess I'm just thinking, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but if they were all monotheists, there's a point in which when you look at the text from when you have a certain pair of glasses on, you're only going to look at it a certain ways. You're limited, that is, on how you're going to look at it. At least when I was a Jehovah's Witness and I read the Bible, there was only a certain range that I would be open to interpret. You know, certain things were like out of bounds. I would never have considered it until I took my Watchtower glasses off. And the fact is, so when they lived in a period of monotheism, it seems to me they're not going to read the Bible in a way that goes against that grain, unless there was a previous, a worldview that went against this. In other words, there was a real change, a reform that took place. Because after the reform, generally speaking, if there was no previous view of two gods in heaven, that's my perspective anyway. They would never be open. They would never be open to thinking differently. You know, they would be like modern Jews. Modern Jews are not open to the idea that Jehovah, basically to things that she's saying or things that the Christians ended up believing. The modern Jews are going to think it's blasphemous, it's out of bounds. But from a first century perspective, if this is something that was a real perspective that we used to believe, it's an older theology, then suddenly it's open.
Yeah, but it's a perspective that used to be, but it wasn't literate, and it wasn't as clear. It was more of a folksy element. Kind of like there's an old joke that says 80% of Cuba is Catholic, but 100% of Cuba is Santero. And by that I mean all these folksy elements that seem to go against the main grain of what they're supposed to be believing. They're not a literary tradition. They're just like this weird folksy thing. The Canaanite in this case. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, but in other words, so it was in the air, like you say, and it was the folk religion, or it was in the culture.
Yes.
And and it's true even today that there are certain things that are in our culture and then we go to church and we're told, no, this is orthodoxy right here. But then you leave church and our culture has a different set of beliefs.
Yeah.
And so it influences you. So they're living in Canaan, and Canaan has a real perspective on its own, and the Jewish priests in the temple are suddenly wanting to say, no, this is the new orthodoxy.
Right, and it's not like, it's not First Temple or anything like that. It's just Canaanite, lingering, latent culture.
But again, I don't see why you want to say it's not First Temple.
Well, I mean, when I keep insisting on that, and I should probably stop, but I think it's going along the lines with what Wayne said before about the continuity. I don't see the continuity.
In other words, the First Temple Jews believed this because they were Canaanites, all right? And even though the official party line changed, the culture didn't entirely change, and so the memory of it was still existing in some pockets. And that's all she's saying.
Well, no, she's saying more than that. She's saying that one of the pockets turned into Christianity.
Yeah.
Or that there's more than there was like a lot firmer links between these things.
Yeah,
I think.
And I think I don't.
Like, I don't think the Gnostics, have a really a connection to First Temple beliefs and stuff. I think their ideas of there being, two gods or different emanations and stuff is just their way of trying to deal with the problem of evil. How could there be evil in the world if God is good?
And Middle Platonism, I think, is the strongest influence.
Yeah. So I don't really. I mean, I see the things there having a different origin being more plausible than the origin that she needs to have her continuity.
I mean, I could possibly see why you might be turned off somewhat on what she's doing, because she's doing it as an apologist, whether she wants to call it that or not. She's trying to defend Christianity as having the original understanding.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I just don't see continuity with the First Temple being the best explanation for why these different groups had the ideas they did.
Right.
I think in every case there's better explanations for where these ideas came from.
And even in some cases, a rediscovering or
Yeah.
reinventing of certain concepts. That's certainly plausible.
I guess I'm thinking for them to be open to rediscover these things for themselves, they would. It's much easier to think that the culture, there was pockets still believing in them. In other words, that they could be open to discovering it on their own again. Because
that's true, but that would be like the most vaguest, most nebulous way of maintaining a relationship, whereas I would agree with Leon that it's much more specific that she's trying to argue.
But in other words, well, what I'm saying, though, is that these things are still being believed, still being discussed this way. Like when the scriptures are being discussed, this is the way they're being discussed in certain pockets. Like, in Egypt, the Jewish colony there, this is the way they still believe. In places outside of Jerusalem, in the country folk and their religion, it's more the old time religion, like it's being retained in all these circles, except in the academy in Jerusalem, in a sense.
I can't remember who was maintaining this idea, but somebody I had read had argued that the group in Egypt that was mainly responsible for the Septuagint translation, at least of the Pentateuch, were of a particular type of Judaism, where a lot of fringe ideas, for instance, like a kind of a messianic kind of bent, was kind of hard-coded into that translation, whereas you couldn't find it in the Hebrew text from Palestine, for instance. And that is one of the reasons why Christianity preferred, for instance, to use the Septuagint, and a lot of their scriptural exegesis and midrash and things like that were chosen from the Septuagint because it was more congenial to their ideas.
I got a question. Do we agree with Barker that the use of kurios in place of the Tetragrammaton in translating the Old Testament was a Christian thing rather than really a Jewish thing?
I don't think we have.
I don't think so.
I don't think we have enough evidence to call that.
Yeah, I don't think so.
That was actually one
Not
thing I
call
was
it
most.
one way or the
That
other.
was actually one thing I was most willing to follow her on. Actually, but I wanted to know what you guys thought.
I just think that the tendency towards using euphemisms for the name of God was something that had existed by the time of the Septuagint translation, and that was just the Greek kind of equivalent of doing what the Hebrews are doing when they are reading substitution of vowels. In this case, they just chose a wholly different word to represent the divine name.
Although, Wayne, the reason why that did appeal to me to some extent is knowing that the earliest versions of the Septuagint did have the Tetragrammaton written in.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of copies do.
So the question is, why did it eventually change? And it's possible the Christians did that. They were the ones that seemed to embrace the Septuagint in a way that later Jews rejected.
Right, but that's why I said not enough evidence, because I think that the early copies of this that we do have, I looked into it a little bit too. the early copies that do have the Tetragrammaton also have the Kyrios. And so Kyrios was also in the parallel use.
Right.
And also in the Christian manuscripts, the word Kyrios, when usually applied to Jesus, was shortened with the oh no, I can't think of the term. It was like the letters with the overline.
The Sacra?
Yeah, the Sacra. So they didn't, they went even a step further as far as that. Now you would think that that would reflect also into the Old Testament, but it didn't. It was just strictly a New Testament phenomenon that I know of.
That is a good point, that we don't have the Minia Sacra in the Old Testament. Do we find it in later Septuagint manuscripts, or does it never occur in the Septuagint?
I'm not really up on the textual history of the Septuagint, past a certain point. So I couldn't tell you for sure.
By the way, John, I did hear the similar things to what you had heard about the people that actually had translated, the Jews that had actually translated the Septuagint were of that, basically, I want to say, Essene bent.
I wish I knew whose theory that was.
I have my own crazy conspiracy theory regarding the Minia Sacra in the New Testament, and it probably is a crazy theory that it's probably not true, but I still think it's intriguing. I suggest that because some Christian groups use Christos and other Christian groups use Christos, one meaning anointed and one meaning good, and since the first New Testament, as a bound volume, was attempting to bring different texts from different diverse and disagreeing Christian groups together into one volume, that in order to reconcile the differences, they hid the differences by abbreviating them, so that the Minia Sacra is intentional to hide the fact that some of the texts they're using originally had Christos, when some originally had Christos.
There's a good article in that book, Bart Ehrman and the Quest of the Historical Jesus, where it's edited by Frank Zindler and Price. There's a good article by Frank Zindler on the use of Christos, and I should take a look at that. It's not addressing your theory, Wayne, I don't believe, but it's a good background on the use of the spellings.
Give me that link again.
It's the book.
It's the book Bart Ehrman and the Quest of the Historical Jesus.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I would say the pieces by Zindler I found to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, they were some of the better essays in that book.
Yeah, I agree. Without going into detail into the ones that I didn't enjoy so much.
The one I really enjoyed thinking about, though, although I didn't agree, was the one where he went into an elaborate kind of when he was talking about the background of a kind of scholar that would have to be able to defend, say, like mythicism or the non-historicity idea, and it's like the end result of this person
describing
you have to make this super polymath.
Yeah.
It would be like impossible for a person like that to exist. Even Frank Zindler isn't even in that.
Right, but it was kind of a weird reductio kind of an argument, which I thought was kind of good. Yeah.
But my rejoinder to his argument was you don't really need a super polymath to be able to combat every apologist scholar. You just need the internet, to make your argument widely available. So that's.
Well, you need the internet. You need the internet, and you need a little bit of humility to know when to kind of know, like what you don't know, kind of stuff.
Yeah, and let other people take up the gauntlet for where your particular expertise might end. But it's that communal. Yeah. It's not just always one person that should be the one. Yeah. It's a group effort. Anyway,
or at least I think that's the future. That's the future of knowledge. Yeah.
By the way, I found something I was looking for in Daniel Boyarin's book, just that I wanted to read just a little. The perspective that he's taking of what he sees in Daniel 7 as the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days, that there are two divine figures here, sitting on two thrones in heaven. So in other words, this is the perspective. And he says, the idea of a second God as viceroy to God the Father is one of the oldest of theological ideas in Israel. And then later on, they are among the earliest ideas about God in the religion of the Israelites, comparable to the ancient relationship between the gods El and Baal, in which Baal comes near in his shining storm cloud. El is the transcendent one. El, the ancient sky god of all the Canaanites, his name comes to mean just God in the biblical Hebrew, was a god of justice, while his younger associate, named Baal by most of the Canaanites, but not the Israelites, who called him Yahweh, was the god of war. In the biblical religion, in order to form a more perfect monotheism, these two divinities have been merged into one, but not quite seamlessly. The Israelites were a part of the ancient Canaanite community, differentiated in some extent by different ideas about God that they developed through their historical existence, but the idea of a duality within God was not easily escaped, however much certain leaders sought to enforce it. So in other words, from that perspective, he sounded just like Margaret Barker, even though he didn't want to. He didn't talk in terms of First Temple, but he sure sounded like her to me.
Also, that same phenomenon was occurring also in other religions. You know, Marduk, for instance, taking on the characteristics of whatever their high god was, and also, you know, Baal Hadad and things like. There's always this same pattern, like in the Ugaritic text. I think there is something like that, or maybe it was from somewhere else. But anyway, there is the pattern of a son of the gods eventually becoming the high god because of, you know, historical factors in the cultures, which kind of make these gods more central for whatever historical accidents or things that occur, and that then that process is interpreted theologically in the writings that eventually are recorded. So I think it's like, yeah, there was a Canaanite type Baal Yahweh who basically went through the same process.
A little bit of awkward silence to somebody speaking without their mic on.
Not I. I shot my wad, so.
Oh, Lord.
To be honest, I kind of got distracted and missed a little bit of what you were saying. I'll rewind the Hangout later and listen to some of this again.
Yeah, I'll have to because I don't know.
I got a question though, just in general about the proposition that the Hebrews didn't really, you know, the Josiah reforms didn't really invent monotheism themselves, but a lot of it came from Greek philosophical influence. That, you know, once we get God as being, you know, transient, you know, and outside the universe in a way, the idea there being multiple gods becomes less plausible, and it's just, you know, an outcome of that in a way. And I think that was pushed almost by Greek thinking more than Palestinian thinking. Do you have any comments on that idea?
I think I can you repeat it?
It's just like the origins of monotheism may actually come more from Greek thought than from Hebrew thought.
Can you tell us where it was that the Greeks believed in one God before the Jews did?
Well, I don't think a lot of the Greeks actually believed in all the Greek gods. I think some of them, you know, some of the Greek, the more philosophical Greeks, were monotheists in a way and didn't really believe in all the Greek pantheon.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see Plato fitting that kind of a mono, even though it's not a theism. It kind of fits what we're talking about.
I would push it back to Persian influence because a lot of that Hellenistic stuff has its roots in Persian thinking too. For instance, you know, linear history. You know, the Greeks ran with it in a different way and eventually invented the scientific outlook eventually.
Yeah.
But it's that Persian wellspring, I think, that influenced a lot of the cultures, the first really major world empire.
We can thank Alexander for that.
Would you consider Zoroastrianism as a true monotheism, since Ahriman, the evil god, is just as eternal, just as it seems like he's a perfect balance to Ahura Mazda? In other words, it seems like it's clearly two gods there, not one god over a subservient.
It's a yin yang.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was pure monotheism, but I think Judaism, as a descendant of that, became the first real representative of it, because they had that problem with good and evil, because they had no evil god.
Zoroastrianism is like a yin yang, where it's like you can't separate one from the other, kind of.
And also, like all the cultures, there was like this tendency to see like a divine oneness behind all the gods. That was an evolutionary kind of thing, I think.
So, John, are you suggesting that they were not, that the Jews were not monotheistic? That the Josiah reform was not. They did not become monotheistic then, but that only once they were influenced by the Persians in the exile?
Yeah, I think they were retrojecting it back to give it a earlier pedigree for whatever nationalistic or political, social, or religious motives they might have had. If there was any kind of change in religion, I doubt if the Bible is giving us an accurate picture of it.
Because the Bible doesn't. The Bible doesn't paint the picture of any reform going on at all. This is only what critical scholars see as, this is when, like, for example,
I wouldn't agree with that.
It's presented as Deuteronomy was found in the temple. It's not like this is when we wrote the book of Deuteronomy and this is the new law. There's no idea that this is suddenly when we're all monotheistic. No, monotheism in the Bible was something that we all believed all the way back to Abraham.
Yeah, but I'm not saying that monotheism was a part of the Deuteronistic reforms. I think it was already existent. What they were trying to impose was a different way of worship. What occurred, say, like in the time of Josiah, would be, from their perspective, as it's laid out in the Bible, is that they were gone astray. They found the book of the law, which they weren't following, and then there was reforms to reform the practices back to a more authentic, earlier version. That's what the Bible presents. And I'm not saying that, they're trying to say that monotheism was invented during Deuteronomy. No, it's gone all the way back to the beginning of time as far as the Jews are concerned.
Anyway, my question I was asking about whether monotheism may have came from the Greeks is probably premised on a misunderstanding of something vague that I've heard said by a minimalist scholar somewhere. About pushing it later in time when the Jews became monotheistic, and twisting some things around with the origins. And I don't know. Like I said, I didn't hear enough details. It's a vague recollection of something I've heard.
Maybe Margaret Barker's got you all confused, Wayne.
No, this is something I remember from before Barker, but I can't remember what minimalist scholar they were talking about who proposed this kind of an idea.
Well, you know how radically monotheistic Islam is?
Yeah.
And yet they have jinns and you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like there's no clear line there.
Yeah, I think in a lot of the older literature, I'm kind of speculating again on the language now, but I think the term, God, the terms I use for God just mean power, actually. And the idea of monotheism comes from a time, I think, when there's a transient God outside the world and you're responsible for everything. So then you have the same term being used for that power as all these other powers. But I still think there's people, even in a context where we have a one God who's outside the universe, they still have other powers in the universe that are called gods, just because that's what the term had historically meant.
Right. Yeah.
Clearly, in a monotheistic concept, nobody says that the god is the only spirit creature. There's all sorts of rankings of different spirit creatures, and usually in these different worldviews.
Yeah.
But God, in their idea, God is of a qualitative, different nature. You know.
But I think there's still an issue of language of the the ancient word for El or Elohim or stuff being used to mean powers.
Right, and that also raises the question vis-a-vis Margaret Barker's book. If that's the case with religions in general, that they have the spirit being kind of symbiotic, synergistic relation with the main god. Is it really two gods, or is it just like this kind of a thing? I'm just kind of brainstorming here.
Yeah. One God, which you only really word, what word do we call it to distinguish it from these other powers that we also call gods? Even though the first one's the only one that's truly the pinnacle here.
Right, and then
they're using the same words for both. That's where the confusion comes in.
And in which case, how much power can we ascribe to the second great angel?
Yeah.
So, Wayne, are you suggesting that the earliest concepts of God were kind of like what people would consider a more advanced concept, a holy transcendent being?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay.
I'm thinking that came up later. Yeah.
Yeah, that's later developed. It starts off, anthropomorphic, our tribal God.
So I'm thinking as that arose, the idea of just other power, of other spirits, and using the term Elohim for spirits, it was still in vogue.
But you're not suggesting that that El, the transcendent El, or El Elyon, as a transcendent being, was a later development, are you?
No, that's not what I'm meaning. But what I'm meaning might be confused. So
it sounded like you were suggesting that the concept of a transcendent being is always a later development in the evolution of religion, and that.
Well, I do think that is. Yeah, I think the original, even in Hebrew literature, the original gods, both El and Yahweh are anthropomorphized, ideals. And
yeah, I do think that's
it's anthropomorphic, I should say, not anthropomorphized. But I think only later we have, an actual transcendent, outside the universe God.
I do think that that's part of the natural history of religions, kind of in a way.
Yeah. But I think in the same time period, that the term Elohim is being used to refer to just powers and angels in various places in the Old Testament, and not to this transcendent God.
Yeah, I think there's a point, I'm not sure where in the book, where she doesn't she go into like all the different ways that it's used? I think I was reading that there.
I don't remember specifically.
Yeah, it's like, in some cases it could mean like sons of God, or it could be king, or just, Lord, judge, that kind of stuff. It has a lot of variety of meanings. Mm-hmm. But they all seem to derive from, that sense that a power of some kind, whether it's an all-powerful or a powerful human, that kind of thing.
The other question I have, and I know Barker takes some of this stuff seriously. I mean, he actually believes this stuff and takes it seriously as a matter of faith. But does she believe her second God was, eternal, in the past, or does she believe the second God was created? Because there's so many texts, about wisdom being created as the first of the works and stuff. Was she an Aryan or not?
I think she's an Aryan, though I was wondering that too, Wayne, and that's my perspective.
Yeah, it's hard to say, about what a person's personal beliefs are, but it seems that that's what's the implications anyway.
Yeah, I see that.
Okay, I was making sure I wasn't misreading that. If you guys agree on that, I'm actually seeing what she's presenting on that.
Yeah, I think that was kind of part of, especially for the earlier part of the book. I even got that. So
I don't remember her ever saying it explicitly, maybe because she wants to avoid controversy with people, No, Jesus wasn't created, But
She's already skirting heresy as it is. She'd put a lot of people on.
it's like she could be considered like a heretic in 3 different schools.
Yeah.
Exactly. She's got to look for the friends she can.
But yeah, there's lots in this book. I'm glad I read it also, just because people refer to it a lot. I've been hearing Price refer to it, and it gives me context for what he's talking about when he refers to it. So I had no context before. And there's lots to think about in what she brings up, but like I said, I still don't think I really buy her overall thesis, though. I feel like we're being duped.
I wouldn't go that far. I don't think we're being duped. I think we're being, she's got these wild speculations in some cases and some plausible speculations in some other cases. And she's trying to make a case, and I think she's done a pretty good job. It's up to us to kind of, it either makes sense or it doesn't.
Yeah.
And for me, I think I kind of meet her halfway.
Yeah, I kind of feel that way, yeah. But mainly just feel so confused, I don't know where to go with it. So I feel I should meet her halfway just to be charitable.
The places that you think you're being duped are, in my opinion, are examples of the right doctrine from the wrong text. So I think she's got the right perspective, but that she's trying to fit certain texts sometimes into that, which that's not what those texts are trying to say. So those are just the wrong texts.
Yeah, I don't think she's being ingenuous. I just think that she sees it a certain way. She's trying to convince the reader of it, and you could either go with it or not. But I don't feel I'm being duped or anything.
No, I don't mean yeah, I do believe she believes. I don't mean duped as in you're trying to pull a fast one on us. I mean, I just think that I don't think that she's necessarily right, and I don't think we should follow her on that. I don't think on what she's saying in her thesis. That's all I really meant. I mean,
no, yeah,
I think it's an elaborate conspiracy theory, basically. A different way of putting it.
Well, I think it's really creative exegesis.
Yeah.
It's a really creative exegesis, or whatever the word is.
I see more eisegesis than exegesis. That's probably my issue.
Right. I mean, that's always like a interchangeable kind of like, where's the line between polemicism and apologetics,
So to sum up in one sentence, good book, glad I read it.
Yeah.
But I think we should say we're done with it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really glad I read it, though, specifically because what I mentioned before. I kind of specialize in New Testament and Christian origins, like past this point, and so I don't often read Old Testament stuff, and so this has been kind of eye-opening, at least in the sense of realizing that, and I already knew this before, but this kind of reinforces for me that Judaism in the first century was not as radically monotheistic as we have been taught to believe.
Yeah,
I'm willing to believe that.
Yeah,
not much convincing. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to fill in my Old Testament knowledge more too. I'm really weak when it comes to the prophets and things, and I really need to. I really hope we can get a good book in the future that deals with the prophetic writings.
Well, if you find one, we'll vote on it.
I think John was ready to say goodbye to this book on our second discussion.
I think so.
Yeah. Because, I got it. I got the point. Now it's like, okay, do I accept every single piece of evidence? No. But, overall, I think she's got a good point, so, okay. I can go on another book.
Right on.
So does anybody want to
So have we decided how many chapters, or how, is Dead Rings even divided in chapters? I don't remember how it's divided up. How much we're reading for next Hangout?
I don't. Did we want to? Well, we should probably discuss this offline. But I was thinking about, I know Doug wanted to take a week off somewhere, which he already got.
Yeah.
So what we could do is like take the week off to plan for the actual first Hangout. Maybe that would work.
Maybe, yeah.
That's fine for me.
I'm easy.
Yeah, I'm easy.
Okay then.
Reuven's
Is still with us?
Oh, that was John asking if we want to shut off.
Thank you. Thank you for watching Biblical Criticism Book Club Hangout. Join us for the next one. Dermot Heddering's The Fabrication of Paul.